The gavel hadn't fallen yet, but Dr. Claire Bennett already knew how this was going to end. She sat alone at a folding table in conference room B of St. Auburn Medical Center, her hands folded on top of a manila folder 3 inches thick. Across from her, 5 members of the hospital board sat behind a raised table like a tribunal, fluorescent light bouncing off water glasses no one was drinking from. At the center, Board Chairman Harold Voss adjusted his reading glasses and cleared his throat for the second time in a minute. A habit she'd learned over 6 years at this hospital. That meant he'd already made up his mind before he opened his mouth. "Dr. Bennett," Voss said, not looking up from the folder in front of him, "we're going to need you to walk us through some discrepancies in your credentialing file. Specifically," he flipped a page, "the 18 months you've listed as overseas surgical deployment, Department of Defense." Claire kept her voice even. "That information is accurate." "Is it?" Voss said. It wasn't a question. Harold Voss had chaired the board for 11 years, and in that time he had built the hospital's reputation on exactly 2 things: fiscal discipline and the absence of scandal. He did not consider himself a cruel man. He considered himself a careful one. And carefulness, in Harold's world, meant that anything he could not verify was, by definition, a liability. "Here's my problem, doctor," he said, leaning back. "I called the number listed for your supervising officer. Disconnected. I requested your surgical logs from this so-called deployment. Classified. No further information provided. I asked the Department of Defense's public liaison office to confirm your service. They had never heard of you." A murmur went through the other board members. Dr. Whitmore, chief of general surgery, and a man who had spent the better part of 2 years quietly losing OR block time to Claire's growing reputation, folded his arms with something that looked suspiciously like satisfaction. "So forgive me," Voss went on, "if I find it difficult to simply take your word for it. We are a hospital, Dr. Bennett, not a spy novel. When a surgeon's R.A. Sume contains 18 unaccountable months and a title she cannot substantiate, that is not a gap in paperwork. That is a liability sitting in my operating rooms. I can't disclose deployment details," Claire said. "That's not evasiveness. That's the nature of the work. Convenient," Voss said. "Very convenient. That the one part of your history we can't check is the part propping up your entire reputation as some kind of battlefield miracle worker. I've heard the nurses talk, doctor. She's done things no one's ever seen. Do you know how that sounds to a board responsible for this hospital's liability insurance? It sounds like a fabrication with a very good bedside manner." The Claire's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She had learned, a long time ago, in rooms much louder and much more dangerous than this one, that the worst thing you could do under fire was let someone see exactly how deep the wound went. "Effective today," Voss said, sliding a single sheet of paper across the table. "Your surgical privileges are suspended pending a full credentialing review. You may remain on unpaid administrative leave during the investigation." Voss nodded to the far end of the table. "Dr. Whitmore has asked to speak on the matter." Whitmore stood, smoothing his tie, enjoying every second of it. "I've worked alongside Dr. Bennett for 2 years. I'll say this plainly. Her clinical outcomes are excellent. I've never disputed that. But her account of where she learned to operate the way she does has never sat right with me. Field amputations. Emergency thoracotomies without imaging. Techniques she says she picked up overseas. I've asked colleagues at 3 different military hospitals. Nobody's heard of a Dr. Claire Bennett attached to any unit, anywhere. Because I wasn't attached to a hospital," Claire said quietly. Then what were you attached to? Whitmore said, spreading his hands to the room. This is the entire problem. She won't say. I move, Whitmore said, that pending verification, doctor. Bennett's license be flagged with the State Medical Board as under review for credential fraud. Claire's stomach dropped. A credentialing suspension was recoverable. A state fraud flag was a career death sentence. She'd never get privileges anywhere again, regardless of how this hearing ended. Second, said the board member to Voss's left, barely looking up from her phone. Chairman, Claire said. And for the first time her voice cracked, not from fear, but from the particular fury of watching 6 years of 80 hour weeks get filed under a lie she wasn't permitted to disprove. I am asking you, formally, to table this motion until I can provide documentation through the proper channel. It exists. It takes time to declassify. We don't have time, doctor, Voss said. We have a hospital to protect. All in favor, Voss said. 4 hands went up, only the youngest board member. A resident representative who'd scrubbed in with Claire 11 times and had seen her rebuild a shattered femoral artery with her bare hands in a hallway during a mass casualty drill. Kept his hand in his lap, jaw tight, saying nothing because saying something wouldn't have mattered. Motion carries, Voss said. Dr. Bennett, security will escort you to collect your belongings from your locker. Please surrender your hospital ID at the front desk. Claire stood. She did not argue further. She had learned that too. A long time ago. You did not waste your last shot at dignity begging people who had already decided not to listen. She was 3 steps from the door when it opened from the outside. The man who walked in wore a plain gray suit that did nothing to disguise the way he moved. Economical, alert. Scanning the room the way people scan rooms when they've spent years walking into places that might be about to kill them. 2 more men followed behind him, younger, in civilian clothes that still somehow read as a uniform. One of them had a visible pink scar tracing from his collarbone up the side of his neck. I apologize for the interruption, the lead man said. He didn't sound sorry. He sounded like a man used to rooms rearranging themselves around his presence. I'm looking for Dr. Claire Bennett. I was told this was her hearing. Voss straightened. And you are? Lieutenant Commander Raymond Dalton, United States Navy. I commanded the platoon docker. Bennett was attached to during her deployment. He glanced at the suspension, notice still sitting on the table in front of Voss. I'd like to know why that's on the table. This is a confidential credentialing matter, Voss began. With respect, Chairman. I flew 4 hours to be here, specifically because it stopped being confidential the moment my office received a request from your State Medical Board asking the Department of the Navy to confirm or deny that a surgeon under investigation for fraud had, quote, fabricated a story about combat deployment. Dalton set a sealed folder on the table. Embossed with a government letterhead none of them could read from where they sat. I'm here to unconfirm that. It was at that exact moment that the younger of the 2 men behind him, Petty Officer Aaron Diaz, 26 years old, the one with the scar, made a small, strangled sound and dropped to one knee. The room froze. Voss half rose from his chair. Someone call. Don't, Claire said. Her voice had changed completely. Gone was the careful restraint of the last 20 minutes. What was left was flat, fast, and absolutely certain. She was already moving. Dropping her folder, crossing the room in 4 strides, and kneeling beside Diaz before anyone else had processed what was happening. Talk to me, she said, 2 fingers already at his neck, the other hand pulling his collar open. Chest. Diaz gasped. Same side. Feels like before, Old wound? Claire asked, already unbuttoning his shirt with a speed that looked less like panic and more like muscle memory running 12 years deep. Pneumothorax. 18 months back, Dalton said, crouching beside her without being asked, his voice dropping into the same flat cadence as hers. The cadence of people who had done this together before, in worse rooms than this one. Repaired. Should be stable. Not anymore, Claire said. She pressed 2 fingers along his ribs, found the spot. Watched his breathing hit shallow and fast, the color draining from around his mouth. Tracheas shifting. This isn't a flashback. This is a tension pneumo redeveloping. I need a 14-gauge needle, or the biggest one in that crash cart in the hallway right now. Doctor. Whitmore, still standing at the far table, blinking, said, "You can't just... This is a boardroom. We don't have... Then get me a pen." Claire snapped, not looking up. Hollow barrel. Now, the resident board member, the one who hadn't voted, was already sprinting for the door. She found the landmark by feel. The second intercostal space at the midclavicular line, the same spot she had found, in dust and dark, and worse light than this a dozen times before. And when the crash cart arrived 40 seconds, later she didn't hesitate. The needle went in with a practiced, brutal precision, and the hiss of trapped air escaping was audible in a room that had gone completely, utterly silent. Diaz's breathing eased almost instantly. Color came back into his lips in real time. "There we go," Claire said quietly, her hand steady on his shoulder. "You're all right. You're not back there. You're here." Dalton exhaled, long and slow, and looked up at the row of board members still frozen behind their table. "That," he said, "is Lieutenant Commander Bennett, United States Navy Reserve. Attached to my platoon as our trauma surgeon for 18 months in a location I am not authorized to name in this room. She did that same procedure in the field, in the dark, under fire, on 3 separate occasions that I personally witnessed. One of them was on me." He looked directly at Voss. "So when your credentialing letter went out asking whether she fabricated a war record, it landed on my desk. I do not fly across the country for paperwork, Chairman. I flew here because a woman who kept my men alive was about to lose her license over a story you decided not to believe." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Harold Voss looked at the suspension notice, still sitting on the table, then at Claire. Still kneeling on the floor with her hand on a young sailor's shoulder. Her sleeve stained through with the same efficient calm she'd apparently once applied under mortar fire. He looked, for the first time in the entire hearing, uncertain. "Dr. Bennett," he said. His voice had lost every trace of its earlier edge. "I owe you an apology. Several, actually." "You do," Claire said, without looking up, still watching Diaz's breathing even out. "I made a decision based on what I could verify on paper," Voss said. "I told myself that was due diligence. It wasn't. It was me refusing to sit with something I couldn't fully control, and letting that refusal cost you your career instead of costing me a little patience." He picked up the suspension notice, folded it once, and set it down again, like it had suddenly become something fragile. "I filed a motion to flag you for fraud in front of your peers. That will be withdrawn within the hour, in writing, with my name on it." Whitmore, still standing at the far end of the table, said nothing at all. He didn't meet her eyes. He picked up his folder and left the room without another word, and that, Claire understood, was as close to an apology as a man like him was ever going to manage. The resident board member, the one who hadn't voted to convict her, knelt down beside her and Diaz, quietly helping steady the makeshift chest seal, and said only, I'm sorry I didn't say something. You didn't vote against me, Claire said. That's not nothing. Voss stood, walked around the table, and extended his hand to Claire as she finally rose to her feet. For what it's worth, Doctor, and I understand it isn't worth much right now, I would like this hospital to keep you. Not because Commander Dalton walked through that door. Because of what I just watched you do without 1 second of hesitation. In a room you had every reason to walk out of. The Claire looked at his hand for a moment before she shook it. Get Petty Officer Diaz to imaging in the next 20 minutes. That's the only thing I need from you right now. 6 months later. The credentialing fraud flag had long since been rescinded, and Claire Bennett's name was back on the OR board at St. Auburn. Though these days, 2 afternoons a month, it was also on a different kind of schedule, a combat trauma seminar for surgical residents. Co-taught. On the rare occasions his deployment schedule allowed it, by a Navy officer who still called ahead before he walked into any room she was in. Harold Voss never brought up the hearing again, but the framed Commendation Commander Dalton's platoon sent the hospital, thanking St. Auburn for producing, in his words, the finest trauma surgeon I have ever served beside. Still hangs in the front lobby, exactly where he insisted it be placed. Claire doesn't look at it much. She's usually too busy walking past it, on her way to the next one.